What is a peptide specifically?
A peptide is a small linear, like straight line chain of amino acids.
Right.
So amino acids are the basic building blocks of protein. Proteins are what makes up our body, our structure, our tissues, our organs. Protein is an essential macronutrient.
What is responsible for the recent surge in popularity of peptides?
Peptides didn't blow up that fast, but what peptides also had was they work. We don't have really much human data at all. It's a very unique situation where we don't have a ton of human data, much at all, but we have an overwhelming stockpile of anecdotal.
What is a peptide doing that's any different than, let's say, taking a Tylenol or taking gabapentin?
What he calls peptides, cellular communication, the language of the human body. That just resonates with me so well. It's so beautiful because what do we observe that's different between peptides and medications?
How could you tell someone that you have a peptide that could cause the release of growth hormone, knowing what we've already seen from growth hormone in the past?
I always still like to err on the safer side. And the good news is,
when it comes to peptides and their recent popularity, it seems like 2010, kind of an esoteric word. It floated around the ether. You didn't really hear much about it, but it was there. 2015, it was this niche secret community. You were kind of a part of the cool crowd if you knew about peptides, if you were applying them and getting into more of the functional health applications. And now it seems like, I mean, I look on podcasts, I watch articles, and you see peptides everywhere. They've really blown up. What
yes.
is responsible for the recent surge in popularity of peptides?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting, right? It's a great question. And, speculating, of course, but I actually think that this wasn't a situation like GLP-1s, which had a lot of celebrity endorsement.
Hmm.
And also the fact that GLP-1s work really well, right? They work really well, and some celebrities on social media, combination, bam, blew up. Peptides didn't blow up that fast, but what peptides also had
Hmm.
was they work. And so it's been more of a slow and steady growth with it hitting this sort of parabolic kind of exponential growth right now, but still not as hard hitting as the way Ozempic blew up. And I think, again, that was because you had all three things working together. Peptides is interesting because if you take a step back, like you said, 10, 20 years ago, it was really bodybuilders. It was
Hmm.
bodybuilders who started this. And, a lot of people don't realize this, but testosterone therapy in an optimization space, also we have bodybuilders to thank. It was, it was these guys, some gals experimenting with their own bodies and building enough anecdotal observation of how things work to kind of set a baseline to then where science could take it from there. So,
Hmm.
but with peptides, it definitely started with the bodybuilders, access to unfortunately scrupulous sourcing, but we'll talk all about that in a little bit. But I think really it has been a situation where we're finally seeing enough people talking about
Hmm.
something that works. And it's so interesting too, and I'm sure we'll get into this as well, but we don't have really much human data at all. It's such an it's a very unique situation where we don't have a ton of human data, much at all,
Hmm.
but we have an overwhelming stockpile of anecdotal, right, data. And I mean, we're talking at the point now where I'm comfortable saying we're probably at the point where millions of people are reporting a combination of results with very low side effect profile. And we've just never seen that. And you think about medications and, efficacy, but side effects, right?
Right.
Very different.
Okay, so you have this new product, new peptide. Let's talk about its safety and efficacy and where the hell it comes from. Like, what the heck is it? So what is a peptide specifically?
Yeah. Yeah. So in a literal sense, a peptide is a small linear, like straight line chain of amino
Right.
acids. So amino acids are the basic building blocks of protein. Proteins are what makes up our body, our structure, our tissues, our organs, right? So protein is an essential macronutrient. So we need amino acids to build the tissues in our bodies and our organs. And so think of a peptide like a small protein, specifically a small linear chain, and then these chains are then twisted and bent, and they end up possessing some three-dimensional configuration.
Mm.
And what's so interesting about it, it's the unique shape that gives it its unique function. and they're produced in various tissues in the body. So I always use the analogy of hormones. That's the best way. Most people, I would say, have a better understanding of hormones for sure than peptides. And hormones are produced in glands and they float around the bloodstream, and they have some effect somewhere else on the body. And because they are floating around, they have a systemic effect. Peptides will also have a systemic effect as well to whatever target tissues. What makes peptides different, and the few small kind of nuanced things, is it's more targeted communication, right? So like testosterone, for example, very potent male androgenic hormone. There's a ton of organs in the body that have receptor sites for testosterone. With peptides, we generally, in not all cases, see more targeted communication. For example, one very popular peptide, probably has been one of the most popular peptides, I think, to this point, are the growth hormone secretagogues, which are produced in the brain, specifically closer to the hypothalamus, and they're released. They float down the vasculature, make their way to the pituitary gland, and that's all they target. Is they target just the pituitary gland. Even if some peptides would happen to float somewhere else, they target the pituitary gland for a specific function. In this case, to cause the release of growth hormone. And peptides also degrade really fast too. Sort of another difference too. But even though they degrade, you could have peptides that once they activate a certain process, they can last significantly long period of time. So not a whole lot of difference. If you really want to walk away, what matters, just like a hormone, they're released, they float through the bloodstream, and they target a tissue or set of tissues to turn on to activate a certain process.
Okay, now how does that differ from, let's say, a medication? So you have Tylenol to morphine all the way up to Dilaudid, right? And it's going to enter the body and shut down the pain receptor. You have gabapentin, it'll turn off a nerve. So what is a peptide doing that's any different than, let's say, taking a Tylenol or taking gabapentin?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting, right? And I really love the way Dr. Seeds, I've always called him the godfather of peptide therapy, and I think many people do. It was his research and work, trainings that he's provided that's really, I guess when you asked me the question earlier, how did this grow? I honestly think that he had a lot to do with it. I really do think now, and I'm glad that we're kind of circling back to that, because he really did expand some exponential growth because he provided a base for clinicians. And that was what was necessary, because you're not getting any of this from the powers that be. We're not getting any support from the regulatory bodies, and we hopefully have time.
Yeah.
Hopefully have time to, to get into that. But what he calls peptides, cellular communication, right? The language of the human body. That just resonates with me so well. It's so beautiful, because what do we observe that's different between peptides and medications? We see this is very significant, a significantly lower side effect profile with peptides than we do to pharmacological agents. And it makes sense, right? Because drugs are foreign to the body, right? There isn't a single, I shouldn't say a single, but there hasn't, to my knowledge, been a single drug that's been produced to match, to have some sort of biological identical aspect to something in our body, which if it was, we'd probably call it a peptide. Peptides are comparable to medications, in my opinion, because there's no supplement that ever comes close to the strength of medications, right? Nobody in a dire life or death situation is looking for a bottle of supplements to save their life, right? And this is why I have so much respect for medicine, modern medicine, what it's done for us. Medications are powerful and worth the risk in life-threatening and even semi-life-threatening situations.
Okay.
But, and I don't want to go down too far down the rabbit hole, but they're overused. There's no ability for them to be really in a conversation about prevention. So, but peptides are the most powerful yet holistic, more natural, non-foreign thing, right? Because we make them in our body. And the human body makes, from what I've seen in the literature, thousands and thousands of different peptides that all have a unique role, have a unique process. And we've only manufactured a small percentage of these. And what's so crazy to me is, and I've heard Dr. Seed say something like this, can you imagine if your doctor had all the peptides that we make on a shelf or available to prescribe? We probably wouldn't need medicine. Now, can you imagine a world like that? This is fairy tale though, because we know this would never happen. We've talked about this in many other podcasts that, there's too strong of a grip that the powers that be, big pharmaceutical companies have.
Mhm.
So that's never going to happen. And I'm not necessarily saying that's the best. I don't know. We'd have to actually look at that. I'm just kind of playing with that idea in my head. But peptides are powerful. From what I understand too, there's only one individual in the studies that have ever died.
Mhm.
And that was from a specific situation with growth hormone secretagogues. And anecdotally, right, take that for what it's worth, I've never seen or heard of a single reported adverse event of any kind. So, not saying it hasn't happened, but I have a hard time believing that if it did, we wouldn't know about it.
Right.
I mean, you saw what happened with stem cell therapy when, there was one batch of stem cells that infected. Nobody died, but some people got seriously ill. It was all over the media. It was blasted. And, again, why is that? Why is nobody blasting the media with the hundreds and thousands of overdoses and interactions and deaths that happen from medications every single day? Why is anybody talking about that? Well, I think you guys are smart enough to get it. But peptides basically, to me, are nature's medicine.
Mhm.
And I know people have thrown that term around a lot, and I get a little bit like, okay, let's not call supplements medications. We can call them medications in the sense of using a bunch of lifestyle strategies, putting them together can be as powerful as medicine.
Mhm.
But now we have a therapy, a singular therapy that actually, and that's what makes medication so special, right? Because they're so powerful. Just take this thing and this thing will happen. Like that doesn't exist in holistic medicine.
Right.
Holistic medicine is more, let's put it all together and get a slower effect in the right direction. And sometimes life or death situations, we need the fast, powerful thing.
Mhm.
Peptide therapy is the closest thing we've had to that. And
Right.
so that's why I call it nature's medicine, because it really truthfully deserves that sort of respect. And again, the side effect profile is just not there. You could take, in most cases, 100 times, right?
Mhm.
And sadly, because people are so confused, and I think we're going to talk about the dosing for us, later, but it is extremely difficult to OD on peptides. And worse that would happen in a situation like that, taking 10 to 20 to 100 times the intended dose, nausea.
Mhm.
They've done literal studies because they do these toxic studies, and unfortunately, mice and animals are the ones taking the brunt of this, but they purposely overdose these peptides and have with PPC, for example. I mean, it took 1,000 times the therapeutic dose to kill a mice. Like you're not going to do that.
Right.
So medications now, on the other hand, the toxic level is significantly, that threshold is significantly lower, which is why they're dangerous. And that's how all toxic substances are
Mhm.
rated, and their dangerousness of level is how low is the lethal dose.
Mhm.
So I know we kind of tangented there a little
Yeah.
bit, but yeah, I mean, that's how I compare them to medications.
All right. Maybe you'll find this next question a little more challenging. Let me draw on things that you've already brought up and already said. This came to light from the bodybuilding community. I feel like a lot of things come to light from guys and girls playing with their own bodies and then experimenting. So you mentioned the growth hormone secretagogues. Okay, so what do we know from growth hormone from back in the day, from the gym world and the bodybuilding community? Every guy after Arnold Schwarzenegger, there's that big famous poster of him that says conquer, and he has that caved in six pack. He's essentially the last bodybuilder to have that, because right after that, HGH got popular. Before that, it was testosterone and DECA and Winstrol. And HGH caused the growth of the gut. So you had these guys that were huge, and they had these six packs or these eight packs, but they had a turtle shell. So that was one risk. And there are benefits, the anti aging, the cognitive effects, the connective tissue effects. But if you have, unfortunately, God forbid, any form of cancer, we know that GH can cause an aggregation, more importantly, proliferation of cells. And if you have cancer, the last thing you want is for it to metastasize. So, how could you tell someone that you have a peptide that could cause the release of growth hormone, knowing what we've already seen from growth hormone in the past from an exogenous or synthetic source?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I know we have an episode coming up on growth
Right,
hormones.
not to get too into the application of
Yeah,
GH, but how could you really tell somebody that
yeah.
these are two, that this one's better than this one when we know what this one has already done?
It's tough because
Mhm.
even with growth hormone, before we get into growth hormone secretagogues, but just exogenous growth
Mhm.
hormone, again, anecdotally, we knew how powerful it was. We knew it's the fountain of youth. It is the fountain of youth, and so many celebrities were paying outrageous prices, and people still do today. But anecdotally, we've seen these concerns, carpal tunnel, insulin
Mhm.
resistance, which is such a confusing, paradoxical situation because growth hormone is the opposite of insulin, and growth hormone does the things that are associated with the opposite of insulin resistance.
Mhm.
So that is, who knows how that's happening and the mechanisms behind what drives that. And then, like you said, cancer. We know enough about cancer, which by definition is uncontrolled cellular growth, and growth hormone stimulates and improves, IGF-1, for example, which is the most potent growth signal that we have in the human body. So we know that's not good. Now we look at growth hormone secretagogues. And so far, again, as we talked about earlier, not enough human data. So we can only speculate. But anecdotally, we haven't seen, and I haven't heard, being as plugged in as I am to the space, anybody having those kind of risks and those kind of things happen with abuse of growth hormone peptides, as we have seen with exogenous growth hormone. But I always still like to err on the safer side.
Mhm.
And the good news is even with our patients, when we are prescribing, when my medical practitioners
Mhm.
prescribe growth hormone peptides, we're still prescribing a much lower dose and getting their growth and optimizing their GH and IGF levels more to that upper level of an optimal range, right?
Mhm.
We're not going to the super physiological levels that growth hormone that bodybuilders do. Also, we're not exposing our body to a pattern of growth hormone release that's not physiologic. Again, we'll talk about this when we do that episode, but our exposure to growth hormone mimics more of the natural body, and at least when we do it for our patients. So we feel much safer in this space based off of what we know anecdotally and the fact of what we know about peptide therapy too as well. Again, the peptide therapy is just, as a whole, is just significantly safer. And so, but yeah, I mean, technically speaking, we still have the inherent risk of just not being absolute in our knowingness yet. And so, take that for what it is. But I think the ever rapid growing amount of people deciding to use this with a board
Mhm.
certified physician sort of speaks for itself because, like you said, in the last 6 months to a year, I mean, we've seen this sort of slow, steady growth kind of really take off. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 6 months to a year. But I'm convinced we're going to see what we see now, which is, maybe a couple cases of issues, but the percentage
Right.
significantly lower of adverse events, if any, compared to medications.
So do you think the reason that we're not seeing the same responses from people on these peptides as opposed to what we saw almost immediately from people taking the synthetic GH is because they're not doing or they're not getting to or being driven to the same super physiological levels? Or is it the fact that the body is responding to it differently because it's not being recognized as potentially a foreign pathogen or anything else?
Again, this is straight
Right.
speculation, but testosterone therapy is exogenous, and we know testosterone therapy is great, when it's biologically identical. So why doesn't biological identical exogenous growth hormone work like that?
Mm.
So I would say I think that we're seeing peptides give us a better result. So to answer your question, two parts. Because we're not abusing the high amounts, because we're matching more physiological rhythms, which again
Mm.
is sort of the less abuse, right? Because the bodybuilders want to maximize, right? And then possibly something to that piece of it being your body's own natural growth hormone and not an exogenous source. But
Mhm.
truthfully, I mean, nobody can say they know that answer because the research just hasn't been done yet.
Okay. Now getting into the landscape of peptides, because these started as mainly the growth hormone stuff, maybe the healing stuff, BPC, TB5, later came KPV. Then it became brain peptides, Selenx, Cmax, Dihexa. There became life extension peptides like epitalin, right?
Yeah.
There's the copper peptide for skin. With all of that, there's been the same tug of war, it seems, between big pharma and these functional entities, and it seems like, from what I've seen, it doesn't look good
No, it doesn't.
for the peptide family as a whole. And so, what's going on there? What can be done about it? How long do you think the access will last? We need more testing for this stuff because that is what's going to unlock the true safety, which we already know is there, and allow for the masses to be treated. But before we get to that, we have to get past the hurdles that are in front of us first. So let's dive into that. What's going on with the relationship there?
Yeah. So, the FDA recently banned a lot of peptides.
Mhm.
And this isn't the first time they've done this. They did this several years ago when they made the distinction between peptides that were considered a biologic based off of the amount of amino acids in the sequence. The,
Mhm.
the more the longer ones, I think it was like 30 to 33 amino acids in the sequence. Anything above that was considered a biological agent, which to a lot of people doesn't make a lot of sense. But now recently they banned basically some of the most popular used ones,
Mhm.
including BPC 157. And, it's just, so if I was going to come at this with a neutral lens and not feel in what I feel from my entire career about the powers that be, and really look at this like I knew nothing. Okay, so the FDA's position is that we don't have enough human research, and we are concerned over the safety of these. You technically can't. It's like a bullshit technicality.
Right.
It's crazy. That is true. But again, we already know there's millions of people now at this point utilizing this medication. Where are the adverse events? Where are the issues? They're not there. And so I'm not saying that because anecdotal evidence, we should automatically say, like, let's go. That's not what I'm saying. Why the F are we not doing the research?
Yeah.
Why the F are we not putting in the money to do the human studies? Oh, yeah, that's right. Because peptides are not drugs. And so they can't be patented by the big pharmaceutical companies. And so they can't make money off of it. So they're not going to study it.
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be some government intervention. And there's so many paths and ways, and I don't want to go down that conversation of what should they do. There's plenty of other people that know a lot more than I do about that. Like, you figure out the best path, but nobody is figuring out a path. Nobody is putting steps forward.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple peptides that are patented for certain indications, like Semorolin. Semorolin is FDA approved for actual medical-based GH deficiencies, both in adults and children. And then you have tesamorelin, which is FDA approved for a medical condition called lipodystrophy, which is severe depositions of visceral fat in the abdominal areas for HIV patients, which is, we know how detrimental to your health adipose tissue is around the visceral body fat. So, we do have small cases where that happens, but why aren't they putting the time and the money, whoever needs to get this done so that it can be more accessible for people? Well, we know with that happening, we know that means much less drug sales. And so I'm just gonna leave it there. I'm gonna leave it at that. It's a damn shame. So what's the future look like? Well, no one knows. I mean, no, unless you have a contact in the FDA, we don't know what their plan is. Based off of history, I think they're going to continue to do what they're doing, is continue to be more aggressive about the regulation and attempt to decrease people's access to this. So there are still some peptides that did not get banned, like tesamorelin, like Semorolin. I do think that with regard to the future, you will see new versions. I think you will see alternatives. I think you will see creativity behind the production of peptides. And it's going to be a game. It's going to be a game of cat and mouse, honestly. And until something radical happens, and I don't know what that radical thing is, but I'll definitely let everybody know as soon as I see something happening.
Okay. So you have these peptides with potentially amazing applications, but because they're potentially dangerous, not popular yet, right? There's not the...
Because they're technically, I can't prove that they're not dangerous.
So we don't have the money to actually bring the studies to the forefront. Well, the pharmaceutical companies have no incentive to...
Yeah, they have the money. Let's be real.
Okay.
They have the money, but are they... Yeah. For whatever reason, it's not being done. And that's the question.
Okay, so you have that and that. So that brings me to point number 3, which is Ozempic and Mounjaro blew up overnight. Correct me if I'm wrong here. Can't those both be made from peptides?
Hey guys, I wanted to interrupt for a quick minute. If you are looking for a free guide where I break down step-by-step how to implement prolonged and longer fasting successfully, I'll link to it in the show notes where you can get a free copy. Now, back to the show. So, and this is a great topic for discussion too. Like, peptides, they're all synthetic, right? Just like hormone therapy. Bioidentical hormone therapies, they're all synthetic, but bioidentical hormones are synthetically made to be biologically identical to the ones in our body. And so when you really get down to the nuance, the peptides that are in the super safe category are the ones that are biologically identical to the ones to our peptides in our body, or the smallest alterations. Mounjaro, Ozempic, Wegovy. First of all, let's take a step back and just clear up for everybody really quick, because I know it's really easy to get confused. There's only 2 compounds. There's semaglutide and tirzepatide. Those are the chemicals, right? Semaglutide was FDA approved by, and it was the manufacturer of it as Novo Nordisk. Ozempic for diabetes, and Wegovy for obesity. And then you have tirzepatide made by Eli Lilly, which was FDA approved for diabetes as Mounjaro, and obesity, they called it Zepbound. This is what they do. So 6 different names, 2 different indications, 2 different compounds, right? And you do hear people call these peptides, right? So it's actually really, it's really confusing. Technically, by the literal definition of a peptide, right? It's a chain of amino acids, but it's been severely altered, right? So it's still a chain of amino acids, right? So then technically by definition, it's a peptide, but that's where we have to get nuanced here. What's our definition of a peptide? If it's just a chain of amino acids, then great, then yes, it's a peptide. But in our context, unadulterated means that it's biologically identical, right? So now we have a peptide that has never existed before, and they're injecting it, and that's what makes it a drug, because it's been altered, and that's what makes it so more potent. These incretin peptides, and by the way, too, a lot of people use hormones and peptides sometimes interchangeably too as well. This class of incretin hormones, or sometimes they're referred to as incretin peptides, are our body's own natural satiety-based peptides. And so they took those and severely altered them. And they were, look, before semaglutide, before tirzepatide, we had earlier acting ones like Trulicity, and those were needed to be injected every day. Those had some level of efficacy, and those were already altered, but they continued to play with them and alter them more. And then finally they hit it right with semaglutide, the very, very first one, 2017. And then, like you said, celebrity endorsement, good results, Ozempic blew up. But because they are adulterated peptides, they're no longer a peptide, they're drugs. And now they fall into that category of completely altered substances, very, very potent, but they also have a high side effect profile. And you can have drugs that were never based off peptides in the body, and they just were completely manufactured to get a result. And that's what they do. They get a result. So regardless of whether they're completely manufactured without a base peptide to mirror from, or whether they are, in this case, a medication that was started off from a peptide that was in the human body and severely altered, the end result is still a unbiologically identical substance foreign to the body. And going back to what we were talking about before with Dr. Seeds and cell communication and why peptides have a low side effect profile. Peptides have a low side effect profile because it's the human language, right? So you're not forcing like a foreign language. You're just replacing and giving more signals that the body recognizes, versus a drug. It's like trying to jam a message down that will get jammed down, very potent, but then the side effect profile. And again, this is just, this is speculation as to why it exists, but it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. And because of the world that peptides now exist in, it unfortunately leaves a lot of room and opportunity for bad actors, right? And understanding that you have to maintain the highest safety standards possible when it comes to sourcing, and when it comes to these different pharmacies or research companies or lack of research companies. Where are the trustworthy sources to actually find access to peptides?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up, because this is a literal safety concern. So remember I mentioned bodybuilders and how they thank you, for what you did. Self-experimentation really set the pace for everything. But, unfortunately, there's a black market for peptides.
Right.
And look, if you don't already know this, you can go online and buy peptides. No prescription needed, no oversight. And what's so scary to me, because like I said, okay, fine, black market peptides, the stuff we talked about how safe they are. I'm not advocating, but at least it's stuff that's, it's hard to OD on it. But you can literally buy GLP-1s. You can buy semaglutide, tirzepatide without a prescription. And this is literally a substance where if you inject too much, it will kill you.
Yeah.
Drop you into medical grade hypoglycemia. So the threshold is, because again, it's a drug. So that blows my mind, but research companies exist, and many of these companies are overseas and all over the website. Here's how you know that you're looking at a research company, is because you'll see in multiple places for research only, not for human consumption. And then you will see it on the bottle. You will see it on the label.
For animal testing only.
For animal some sort of version of that. And what I've always told, and I'm so glad that Dr. Huberman came out with a recent big episode on peptides, and because I've been saying this for years, but I'm not as famous as Dr. Huberman. And so thank God that he, and he's known for providing accurate, science-backed information. So he talks about a substance that we need to be concerned about, LPS for short, lipopolysaccharides. And this is a toxic substance that is found in some cases in these black market peptides. So where do you go? Like, where do you get safe, efficacious, high quality peptides? You get them through a board certified practitioner. So a board certified practitioner won't be providing black market peptides from research companies. They get their peptides from a state regulated compounding pharmacy.
Hmm.
And state regulated compounding pharmacies, while they're not directly regulated by the FDA, still have to adhere to much higher safety standards, including safety testing and removal of any LPSs. So I know it costs more money, and I know that's the rub, right? And I have respect for people out there taking their health into their own matters, because that's where I'm at with society and our healthcare system, and that's what I educate and advocate for, is people taking responsibility for their health. But it can work against you sometimes.
Yeah.
And this is an example where you need to figure out, if you can afford peptide therapy, it needs to be done right, and it needs to be done safely. Like, this isn't just a matter of, oh, you might get bunk peptides that didn't work. Okay, fine. That's, if you want to play that game and that's your risk and you have enough money to fine. But now we're talking about something that can very well hurt you. And so it's just not worth the risk, in my opinion.
Okay. I'm ready for this fun part, because this is what makes people's heads spin. The administration, a little simpler, but then the dosing. I always think of, sorry, I always think of that. So Zach Galifianakis, is that his name?
Yeah.
The meme with him with the board behind him and all the calculations are going through. Right. So first, with administration, you have people who believe that, hey, a subcutaneous dose is systemic. Then you have people who say, nope, it's my lumbar. I need a paraspinal injection right next to it to make sure that it gets there. You have troches, sublingual. I mean, you have creams. Talk about different forms of administration, if there are any that are better than others, and what you recommend.
So, yeah, we can talk about the different forms first, and then why dosing is so confusing. So the most common form of administration for peptide therapy, hands down, is subcutaneous injection. So that's
Mhm.
tiny little insulin needle into the fat tissue. It could be anywhere in the fat tissue. That's how semaglutide or Zepatide are administered. That's how most peptides are administered. After subcutaneous injections, you can have, and it really does, I mean, we're talking 80% of peptides are probably a subcutaneous injection.
Mm.
I've seen some peptides like AOD, for example, fat mobilizing peptide. You can pop it into a troche form. So a troche is a sublingual, and you can do hormones in sublingual tablets too, but they're tablets in a sublingual form that you pop in between the tooth and the cheek, and they dissolve and they absorb, right? If you let it sit there, they're supposed to absorb through that buccal mucosa, because you have a lot of vasculature there. That's another form of administration. You have creams, just like testosterone and hormones. You can rub your creams on certain vascular areas, like behind the knees, and you get some behind the neck too. There was this point where dihexa, which is one of the most potent cognitive enhancing peptides, was being prescribed. I think you still can get it into a cream. And I remember Dr. Seeds educating people to rub it behind your neck to get, because that's the biggest point of access to vasculature and blood supply. So it'll go straight to the brain.
Oh.
So, and then you even have nasal sprays too, which is awesome. And this is more for the brain peptide space, because you have holes in the back of your nose and you can get up in there, and you can, people that squirt stem cells intranasally too as well. So intranasal application is a medical based form of administration for not just peptides. So creams, injections, troches, nasal sprays, and then I would say finally, probably, I know you could do stem cells this way, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's some I haven't seen peptides, but inhaling peptides like you would for a COPD treatment makes sense to me. So yeah, I mean, these are the different forms that you would see with regards to peptides. Now, the dosing is, I think, the part that is so confusing for people. And look, I made a video, check it out on my YouTube page. We'll link to it on the description notes, Peptide Therapy 101. Like, having worked with so many patients, this is the most confusing part, because a lot of these peptides are shipped in, like for the subcutaneous injections, in a powdered form, and it looks like a freeze-dried substance. It's called lyophilized. And so you have to do a process of reconstitution. And so reconstitution is where you add fluid, specifically bacteriostatic water. And it's got to be bacteriostatic water, because even sterile water, which is free of bacteria and microorganisms, the microorganisms can develop. So you want a low pH and acidic water so to be the base, so that when you dissolve your peptides now, because normally you take that bottle after it's dissolved, pop it in the fridge, and it's going to last you a couple of weeks, and you're back and forth injecting new needles, you are going to inevitably present some microorganisms. And so bacteriostatic water keeps the water devoid of microorganisms, which is very important. But where people get so confused, I would say the most common confusing thing is, I'm injecting 20 units. So how much am I injecting? Or should I be injecting 20 units? People will communicate units as it's some sort of representation of how much peptide. And this is where it gets really confusing, because when you look at a drug, for example, like ibuprofen, you're looking at the pill, and the pill is the measurement of the stuff, the amount of medication, and there's no fluid. So that's all it is. Like, it's one form of communication. But now when you're talking about injecting, you have to take a medication or peptide and dilute it into a solution. And now you're injecting a fluid, but that fluid, right, which is measurement in milliliters or units on a syringe, without knowing the concentration of the fluid inside, which concentration refers to how much of the medication per single, ml, for example, you have no clue, right? So even just explaining that for the first time for somebody, that can get really confusing. And that's why I said, go watch that video. But it's not hard once you get it. But it is going to take you back to probably, I don't know, depending on what school you went to and where you were at, either 4th grade or 6th grade or 8th grade. What would that be? Biology or chemistry probably, and really having to understand conversions and units. But I think it's so vital, because once you understand it, you can have so much more confidence that you are injecting the efficacious dose. And so, yes, you can find peptide calculators online, and you should definitely use those in the beginning. But it's like anything, it becomes so much more powerful for you and effective if you don't rely on the calculator. So
Right. And I think, just to help people out, understanding that volume is never a measure of the strength of what you're taking, right?
Yeah.
If it's units, if it's cc's, right? If it's anything to do with how much fluid, you can cram as much medication into any amount of fluid within reason, right?
Right.
And so if you ever look at, what would you say are all the volumes, measurement volumes that people are going to see that they have to know that is not your actual dose of strength or strength of dose?
Yeah. So units is by far the most important thing. So again, insulin syringes. Most insulin syringes you're going to see are 1 ml, right? So what we need to know is this, right? 1 ml of fluid, 1 milliliter, is equal to 1 cc, which is equal to 100 units on an insulin syringe. Now, sometimes you might get an insulin syringe that goes up to 50. Sometimes you get an insulin syringe that goes up to 30. Nothing changes. It's just the 100 units is 1 ml, the 50 units is 1/2 of an ml, and the 30 units is 3/10, right? A little bit less than 1/3 of the insulin syringe. So units is definitely the most common form that is communicated with regards to the fluid. And you need to know the fluid, because how much of the fluid are you injecting? But just where people get it twisted and confused is they think that represents the amount of the medication. And it does if you were also considering the concentration of that fluid. But when you don't, or you're asking for help or you're communicating and you only provide units, there's no way that other individual can help you unless there's an assumed concentration, which is sometimes that can be.
Right.
But now with these research companies, people are injecting God knows what. There's so many freaking options out there. Don't use research companies, please.
And you've given a good baseline. If you understand those conversions, at least you have a starting point to go off of. Now, in terms of the families of peptides, because they've grown so much now, how would you categorize them?
As far as
well, we already know you have the
categories.
growth hormone secretagogues. So within the growth hormones, which ones are the most popular?
So for growth hormones, Sermorelin, Tesamorelin.
Okay.
Like CJC, 1295, ipamorelin definitely would have been my answer before, but they're banned now. And so you can't get them. But Sermorelin's great, and Tesamorelin is pricey, but Tesamorelin, powerful belly fat, and we'll go into this in our growth hormone episode, but powerful belly fat blaster, because that's literally what it was approved for, is for the belly fat of HIV patients. So those are your two most popular ones. So we have the growth hormone secretagogues. Then we have the healing peptides, and I know we'll do an episode on that. Specifically, you have BPC 157, you have TB 500, You have, I'll mention KPV because that's a gut healing peptide, but I think if we're talking about healing musculoskeletal injuries, you need to be considering gut health too as well. And there's going to be some alternatives to BPC 157 because yes, that one's on the ban list. And then we have the neurological peptides. So the heavy hitters, dihexa, synapsin, and then we have CLANC and CMAX, which are definitely more like nootropic effects. So you can use them in the moment to temporarily improve cognitive enhancement, while long term they're doing that. Versus heavy hitters like dihexa and synapsin. If you had some concerns of dementia or Alzheimer's or neurodegenerative diseases, and you would absolutely want to look at some of those heavy hitters. And then you have some of your one-offs like skin health, like you mentioned, GHK copper, phenomenal for skin health. And then anti-aging peptides specific. I mean, they're all anti-aging, but like what actually potentially slows down the aging process, something that actually literally slows down the anti-aging process, epitalin. So we still have these peptides. We still have access to them, which is great.
Good. And one quick story on on dihexa. You know them. We have two women. Their mom unfortunately has dementia and lupus, and we gave them our sleep protocol. And they said it was the first time in 3 years that she had fallen asleep in her wheelchair downstairs watching TV, and they had to take her upstairs. But even better than that, her verbal recall has increased, and she's actually been remembering meals from the previous day, which is, I think, incredible.
And they have her, in addition to the sleep, we put her on dihexa.
She's doing dihexa, and then she's doing the combination of magnesium threonate, glycine, as well as Best Rest formula by Pure Encapsulations.
Yeah.
And just seeing someone who's been through the entire gamut of specialists and doctors take a family of supplements and one pill peptide and seeing all these changes. I get to speak to her daughters a lot, and it's just wonderful just knowing that something seemingly so simple can have that profound of an effect.
No, I know. And I know we don't have enough time for this episode, but we absolutely need to do an episode where we get into, okay, great. So you're using peptides, you're ready to make the plunge, you're ready to take the investment. Now, how can you optimize your results? And I want to make this clear. I really believe you could potentially double, if not maybe even triple, the effectiveness of your peptide therapy by getting some other pieces in the category of lifestyle. So why the hell would you be spending potentially thousands of dollars if you're not willing to put some effort into this and increase your results? So I definitely think that's going to be a powerful episode. Look forward to that one for sure.
Great, man.
All right. If you guys found this informative, then you're going to want to click this video right there. It's a continued explanation of what you learned today, guys. Knowledge is power, so let's keep this going. We'll see you later.